everybody. Welcome to my session. It's called Putting the C Back in CSS. My name is Aubrey Sambor, and I'm a senior software developer at Acquia here in Boston. I've been developing professionally for over 13 years, and I taught myself CSS and HTML about 21 years ago, so I've been doing this for a while. You can find me online as Starshaped on Twitter, Drupal.org, and pretty much anywhere else on the internet. I love knitting, I love tea, I love dyeing my hair fun colors, though right now, as you can see, I'm in between them right now. I am doing pink and purple in about a month, so I'll be back to my fun colors again. All right, so let's get started. So here's what I'll cover. I'm going to cover these four main things. I will talk about CSS and JS, what it is, why people like to use it over CSS, and why CSS is still relevant today. Next, I'll talk about using the BEM syntax. I'll show you how to write componentized styles using blocks, elements, and modifiers, and some examples of how writing BEM could go wrong. After that, I'll discuss using Sass to optimize your styles using BEM. I'll go over my personal file structure, and then talk about two things that make Sass still awesome. Those are partials and nesting. Finally, I'll bring it all back together by talking about the Cascade and give you a couple examples of how to use the Cascade with BEM and Sass. All right, you ready? Let's go. First, what is CSS in JS? You've probably heard about this thing called CSS and JS. Maybe you've already used it before. What is it exactly if you don't already know? Why are people using this instead of using plain old CSS or Sass? What makes this so special? Well, in brief, CSS and JS is a way to write your CSS within your JavaScript application. Instead of creating a style in a .css file like in this example, or just a plain old button, you instead add the style right to your JavaScript component. CSS and JS is not one particular set of styles. A big thing about CSS in JS is that it leverages JavaScript to write your styles, with the ability to pass JavaScript variables into your styles to control them dynamically. This example right here uses the style components CSS in JS library, which is one of many other CSS and JS libraries that are out there. Here's where the power of CSS and JS comes into play. To add styles with a button with a class of primary, you'd be setting a prop of primary on this particular component using JavaScript like this. This example is also using the style components CSS in JS library. As you can see, in my opinion, these examples tightly couple your CSS to your JavaScript. I'm not a huge fan of this, as I like to keep my CSS, HTML, and JavaScript separate. I'm here to tell you that you can still maintain a separation of concerns while still writing clean and elegant CSS. You don't have to always use CSS and JS. In fact, if you want to utilize the Cascade to its maximum effectiveness, you shouldn't use CSS and JS. So why would somebody use CSS and JS? Here are 3 reasons why people use CSS and JS. These aren't the only 3 reasons, but these are the 3 that I'm going to highlight here. Number 1, the developer might have a familiarity with JavaScript already. You might have been writing JavaScript for a couple years now. So once you heard about a way to write CSS in a JavaScripty way, you jumped right on board the CSS and JS train. You already know JavaScript, so writing styles this way comes much more naturally to you than learning how to effectively write old-fashioned CSS. Number 2, you want to keep your components componentized. If you're writing a React app, for example, you might as well keep your CSS right there inside the component. You can be sure your CSS is scoped only to the component it belongs to, so you don't have to worry about CSS leakage. Number 3, tiny file sizes. Since you aren't loading one huge CSS file on each page, and instead loading styles on a component-by-component basis, your site might load a little bit faster. Theoretically, this will make your site a little bit more performant. So, those all sound good. What's the problem with CSS and JS? Why am I talking about why you shouldn't use it? Well, Kevin Ball of ZenDev said it best. CSS in JS is like replacing a broken screwdriver with your favorite hammer. Sure, CSS and JS might be the right thing to use on your particular project, but is it the solution for every project? Is it the solution for most projects? No. CSS is not broken. JavaScript isn't the answer to every problem. Use the right tool for the job. However, if you want to utilize the Cascade, and you should want to utilize the Cascade, after all, it's Cascading Style Sheets, you shouldn't use CSS in JS. This will be a point I reiterate a few times during this session. Next, I'll go over a few perceived shortcomings of CSS, which will touch on the 3 items I mentioned in regards to why people use CSS in JS. You'll see that these perceived shortcomings are just that, perceived. CSS and JS became popular because of these 3 perceived shortcomings of CSS. These 3 perceived shortcomings are as follows. 1, global namespacing. 2, leaky styles everywhere. And 3, that CSS isn't as important as real, quote-unquote, real programming languages. Let's go over these one by one. First one, global namespacing. First, there's a perception that global namespacing in CSS needs to go away. Here's a quote from Chris Ferdinandi, who's actually from the Boston area, that I absolutely love. The global namespace is a feature, not a bug. The Cascade is a feature, not a bug. One of the biggest arguments against using CSS is that it pollutes the global namespace. What is called the global namespace in other languages, particularly in JavaScript, is business as usual in CSS. The so-called global namespace is a fundamental part of CSS, something called the Cascade. Next, here's a basic example of the Cascade in action in case you needed a little refresh on how it works. Here is an example of a button element. The button element has a font size of 2.2 rem and a background color of a light gray. The button primary class has a background color of a really, really bright pink. You can see them right here on the bottom of the screen. Why is this useful? The Cascade allows you to keep consistent styles across all HTML elements on your page. For example, most of the time, you'll want those buttons to have that gray background. However, you might want a primary button or some sort of call-out button that should be a lot brighter, and that should have a different background color, so here the Cascade will work in your favor. Since you want all your buttons to have the same font size, you don't have to declare the font size again on every single button. Again, the Cascade is a feature, not a bug. Number 2, my CSS leaks. We've all been there. Here we are, minding our own business, adding a fancy new CSS class to our links. And here's an example of a link to read more posts about knitting. This link looks pretty boring. I want to style this read more link differently than the rest of the links on my page. So I'll just add a class of read-more and then, write some CSS so I can style it to make it look a little bit better. Well, let me write my styles and I'll be on my merry way. So, hey, what? Why does my read more link have this weird sparkle background? Where'd that come from? That isn't something I wrote. I do a search in my code base for the read-more style, and after a bit of digging through layer upon layer of CSS, I find it. Somewhere deep within my code, someone put a read more with this sparkle background, and it overrode all my styles. How many times has this happened to you? You think you're being nice and clever. You think you're being nice and clever with your CSS naming foo, and all of a sudden, you find that class already exists. Well, actually, you don't find it right away because it's hidden inside layer upon layer of CSS files embedded throughout your project. Trust me, I feel your pain. Another unfortunate side effect to leakage is not knowing when it's okay to delete a class. Unwieldy CSS structure can lead to a lot of fears that the entire site will come crashing down if one CSS class is removed from the codebase. Will everything blow up? Maybe. You don't know. The code base is such a mess that you can't tell what's used and what isn't. So, every single class stays in the code base for all eternity, destined to remain until the end of time, or in a year and a half when you inevitably redesign your site anyway. Well, this means CSS is bad, right? No. Proponents of CSS and JS use the code leak example of a reason to not use CSS. Everything gets so messy and no one can sift through all that code to find one single instance of a class every single time. Well, let me let you in on something. CSS isn't the issue here. Disorganization is. Incoherence is. Which brings me to my last point. It's that CSS isn't as important as real programming languages. I can't even begin to count the number of developers I've worked with in my career who have told me, "Oh, I'm so bad at CSS. It just doesn't make any sense to me." Why is this? Why can some of the best developers who can rock a back-end framework with everything they have curl up in fear when they hear the word Cascade? More importantly, why is this not seen as big of a deal as someone who hides from the phrase arrow functions? Mandy Michael explores this in her article, "Is There Any Value in People Who Cannot Write JavaScript?" In this article, she recalls posing a question to the audience at a conference she spoke at. In a panel in which she was a part of, someone in the audience asked a question, something like, "Is there a place in the industry for people who just write CSS and HTML?" And you know what? No one put their hand up. No one. Why is this okay? Are JavaScript or PHP or Python that much more important than CSS and HTML? In my opinion, no. An argument I see in regards to this is, "Oh, CSS is easy. Anyone can do it." Again, to quote Mandy, "When every new website on the internet has perfect, semantic, accessible HTML and exceptionally executed, accessible CSS that works on every device and browser, then you can tell me that these languages are not valuable on their own. Until then, we need to stop devaluing CSS and HTML." Oh, and speaking of accessibility, recently, WebAIM put out an accessibility analysis of the top 1 million homepages. Do you know what they found? They found an average of 59.6 errors per page. They found that users with disabilities would expect to encounter detectable errors on 1 in every 13 elements. That's detectable errors. Homepages with ARIA average 11.2 more detectable errors than pages without ARIA. And worst of all, did that work? Let's see. Oops. 98.7% of homepages had detectable WCAG2 failures. 98.7%. I know. This is pretty unacceptable. Some of these accessibility issues come from code like this: a div made to act like a button with a submit handler written in JavaScript. This is not accessible because this is a div that's not an inherent element that supports this out of the box. It doesn't make sense to do this, when it could have just been easy as using a plain old button. The button element has built-in accessibility features, so why throw all that out the window? Well, the developer might not have known enough about CSS. The developer maybe didn't know how to style a button to look good in all browsers. Can you see now that CSS isn't easy? Isn't something to be cast aside for the real programming languages? No, CSS is important too. CSS still has its place in modern web development. Well, let's do a quick recap about CSS in JS. CSS in JS is a relatively new way to write CSS for your JavaScript application. I went over 3 reasons why people might use CSS in JS, and those were familiarity with JavaScript, keeping your components componentized, and wanting to keep your file sizes small. Then I went over 3 perceived CSS shortcomings, and these were global name spacing, leaky styles, and CSS isn't as important as real programming languages. Next up, I'll talk about a strategy to utilize the Cascade, avoid leakage, and build confidence in your CSS writing abilities. So I'm going to first talk about BEM. This is a BEM refresher for people who might not know how it works, so I'm going to go over this fairly quickly. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. What does this mean exactly? Let's dig into these a little bit more. Firstly, there are a few good reasons to use BEM. The first one, it keeps your styles nice and neat and organized, making it faster and easier to find styles when you want to update them. It will also have you avoid pesky code leaks by keeping to a naming convention. You don't have to think about naming things because naming things can be pretty hard. It also works nicely with Sass nesting, and I'll get more into that later on in the talk. Now, let's go over the main parts of the BEM naming convention. The foundational part of BEM are the blocks. This is essentially what modern JavaScript like React would call components. A block is meaningful on its own. Here is an example of a card. I'll use a card as an example of the block. A card can stand on its own without being coupled to other parts of the website. A website can display multiple cards, and each one is a block on its own. And here is the CSS for it. As you can see, it's just a basic card with a padding and a border, and then you just do div class of card. This is pretty bare bones basic example of code for the block. Pretty easy, right? Remember, a card is a basic unit, and it may look like any other CSS you've written in the past. Next up, I'll go into elements. Elements are parts of a block, and they have no standalone meaning. An element is named by first naming the block, writing the block name, in this case, our card, then 2 underscores, and then the name of the element. And here's an example. Here's our card again. I added a card underscore underscore header and a card underscore underscore footer to the card block. And both the header and the footer are elements of this particular card block. And as you can see, they make no sense outside of the card element or card block. That you wouldn't just stick a card header randomly on your website. It belongs with the card. Lastly, we have modifiers. Modifiers are variations of a block to change appearance, behavior, or state. Modifiers are named by first adding the block name, then 2 dashes, and then the name of the modifier. Say I want to display a narrower version of our card. I'd simply add a class of card-narrow to the block element. And now my card component will display narrower. And you can see this in this example because I have a width of 15em on the card-narrow. So this will display a narrower version of the card. Other examples of modifiers are adding a -- active class to a link or a -- disabled class to a button. Possibilities are endless. So what's the downside? There are 2 major downsides to the BEM syntax, and I'm betting most people who have worked with BEM have probably seen both of these. Class names can get really, really long, and structure can get convoluted and unwieldy really, really quickly. Want to see an example of what not to do?
Yes.
Here's an example. Here's an example from a Smashing Magazine article from 2016. There's a different naming convention here with the C-, but that's not the part that's ugly. You can see that there's a C -- card underscore underscore body underscore underscore text underscore underscore link. And it's pretty long and convoluted. A lot of these are pretty long and convoluted, and it looks really ugly, and it looks like it would be hard to update your classes every time you wanted to do something. And it's because they're adding each each grandchild element, the ones that are way on the inside, are getting the class name, or they're getting the names of each of their containers, and so this just looks pretty terrible, and this is why people run away screaming from BEM sometimes. But wait, didn't I just say to add elements to each block? Well, when it comes to BEM, it's best practice to just add the root block name in each element in the card. BEM isn't tied to the DOM, so you don't need to add every single element name to each child. Here's a better version of the card component from the previous slide, which again is taken from that Smashing Magazine article I cited. So this is much better. The class names aren't as long, so the HTML is much easier to read. Also, to use the Cascade, I removed some of the classes from the image, paragraphs, and links in the C card body element. If these styles use the same font size, margins, padding, and so on as the default styles declared in a base or reset style sheet, you don't need to redeclare them here. Let the Cascade do the work for you. Here's a quick BEM recap. BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. I talked about how BEM keeps your styles neat and organized, how we can stick to a naming convention, and how it works nicely with Sass nesting. These were the parts of BEM I went over. I went over blocks, which are entities that are meaningful on their own. Elements are parts of a block, and they have no standalone meaning. And modifiers are variations of a block to change appearance, behavior, or state. Next up, let's talk about Sass and how this fits into the BEM convention. Sass adds a couple bits of awesomeness to your CSS workflow. Yeah, I know. Some people say it's old and outdated and you don't need it anymore. And well, technically you don't need it. It's still nice to have for two main reasons. The first one is being able to separate all your CSS out into partials. And the second one is nesting. And no, nesting doesn't have to be a disaster. Let's go over why these two things make Sass still useful in 2019. First one, Sass partials. Sass gives you the ability to arrange your CSS styles into different files called partials. I use Sass partials to componentize my styles, keeping them separate and easy to find in my folder structure. Here is an example of my folder structure. In this example, I group my partials into 3 different folders: base, components, and layout. All these get imported via the main.scss file, which compiles everything down to one CSS file via Webpack or Grunt or whatever you use to build your site. Next, I'll go over all these 3 folders. First one is my base folder. In my base folder, I have 2 partials. I have a partial for my variables and a partial for all my base styles, which base styles are just for, I'll go into it a little more later. My variables partial contains any font includes, such as font face, Google Fonts, Typekit, whatever I'd want to use for fonts. If I'm using any CSS custom properties, I'll put them in here. Any Sass variables I might want to be using in here. All these will go into my variables.scss folder. This file. This file only consists of variables. I don't actually write any CSS in this variables.scss file. And then I have my base partial. And this contains any base styles I'd like on my site. These are mainly my default styles for my headings, my paragraphs, lists, and so on. Most of these styles will be used in the main body content of my site. If I am writing a blog post and I use H2 headings in the content, I don't want to have to add a CSS class to style these each time. I'd rather my H2s inherit the base style I declare here. Next, my components folder. This obviously contains any components I may create on my site. If my site has a lot of components, then there'd be a lot of files in here. Since my example site is my blog, I only use 2 for now, and those are tags and pagination. Each of these components can live on their own, and can be incorporated anywhere in my site. For example, I can use my tags component on both my home page and on my individual blog post pages. Lastly, my layout folder. This contains, you guessed it, my layout partials. Usually this folder consists of partials for the header, navigation, content, and footer. These partials compose the general layout of my site, and I generally only use them once on my site. Now that I've talked a little bit more about partials, let's talk about Sass nesting. I know, you've probably heard nightmare stories about Sass nesting gone wrong. No, I'm not here to tell you that writing styles that compile to something like this right here, main content, div header, ULLI active, this is too long, this is not a good idea. However, when bemming your styles up, nesting can come in pretty handy, and it can result in legible components if you know what you're doing. Take our card example from earlier, with a card component and a couple elements for the header, body, and footer. In traditional CSS, these styles would be laid out like this. Just a card with the card __ header and the card __ footer. I showed you this earlier when talking about BEM, so this should look familiar with CSS classes for all the different, for the block and the two elements. Sass has this awesome thing called the parent selector, which is an ampersand in Sass, which is very useful when using Sass nesting. You can use it to add a hover state to a link, like this. Did I do that right? Yes, okay, sorry. This will compile to the thing below. As you can see, there's an A with a color, and then I have a hover, and it will compile down to these two styles. As you can see, the hover class was added to the anchor element, all because the hover selector in the Sass portion of the code was nested inside the anchor element. The parent selector is useful in this situation, but it can also be used to keep your Sass components nice and organized. Let's see how to rewrite our card CSS above to be bemmed and ampersanded. This is the card block and the header and footer elements, written in the BEM syntax using the parent selector. You will see that it compiles to the CSS right here, which is identical to the card CSS from a few slides ago, right there. Writing our styles this way keeps them nice and neat and organized, not to mention componentized, and the styles won't leak to other elements. Everybody wins. Now let's do a quick Sass recap. I talked about how Sass can still be useful to write and organize your styles. These are the two parts of Sass that are especially useful. Partials. They give you the ability to arrange your CSS style into different files so you can easily find what you want to edit. The second one is nesting. This allows you to keep your Sass nice and componentized, and it makes your styles easy to read. Why did that not work? Yeah, I'm missing one. Oh well. Next up, I'll talk about how the Cascade fits into all of this. This section will be short, as I talked about all the tools you will need to actually be able to use the Cascade with BEM and Sass. I know, I just told you about how BEM encapsulates your styles so that they don't override each other. So how do I actually use the Cascade and use BEM at the same time? Well, this is how I do it. Remember that base partial I talked about earlier? In there, I defined base styles for list items, the LI element in particular. These base styles are used mainly in my main content area of an individual blog post, when I want to add ordered or unordered lists to my post. This way I don't need to manually add a class to each of these lists in my posts, and they'll just be styled the way I want them to. Here's a screenshot of a part of an individual post on my blog. This is a blog post I have that was about good things that happened to me in 2018, so I wanted to list them in a list form. So this entry uses an unordered list in its content, And these base styles are defined in my base CSS partial, like this. As you can see, I'm declaring a font size. You can only see the font size. There's supposed to be more room down there. I am declaring a font size, a margin, and a line height on this list item element. Next, here's a screenshot of the recent posts section on my homepage. I'm also using an unordered list here, but the line height here is smaller than the line height on the individual blog post. In this case, I've added a class of post-item to each list item, slightly tweaking the line height and margin as so. And I think some of it probably got cut off. Yep. Notice that the font size did not change, yet the font size on both the list item in my blog post and on the home page are the same, as you can see in the code example here. This is because a font size was not declared in posts__item, so the font size will cascade down from the LI and gets applied to the posts__item. Here's another example. Take the narrow card from earlier in the talk. In this example, both card and card -- narrow are defined. The card class defines a background, font size, and width, while card -- narrow defines only a width. Since card -- narrow doesn't define either a background or font size, these styles cascade down to card -- narrow, which inherits these styles. There's no need for me to redefine either the font size or background because I know I'll get them from the card class. This is how I can still use the cascade, but also use BEM to keep my styles organized. And let's do a quick recap on the cascade. You can take advantage of the cascade using BEM. You can define your base styles and allow things like font size or margin to cascade down to BEM blocks, elements, or modifiers so you don't repeat the same styles throughout your components. You can use Sass partials and nesting to keep your styles organized. These cascade examples might seem pretty basic to you if you've been writing CSS for a long time. I wanted to reinforce the idea that the cascade is still an important part of CSS, and some newer developers who have only worked using CSS and JS might not understand how the cascade works. I'm here to tell you that the cascade is still important and still useful to learn and implement in your day-to-day code. So, in conclusion, I talked about a lot of things today. First, I talked about CSS in JS, what it is, why people like to use it over CSS, and why CSS is still relevant today. Next, I talked about using the BEM syntax. I showed you how to write componentized styles using blocks, elements, and modifiers, and some examples of how writing BEM could go wrong. After that, I discussed using Sass to optimize your styles using BEM. I went over my file structure and then talked about two things that make Sass still awesome: partials and nesting. Finally, I brought it all back together by talking about the cascade and gave you a couple basic examples of how to use the cascade with BEM and Sass. Here is a list of sites I referenced, it's not cut off, and a credit to Jeff Appleby, whose reveal.js theme I forked and edited slightly for my slides. If you wanted to do further reading about any of the articles I mentioned in this talk, and I also included a couple other links that might be interesting, like reading the What's Wrong with CSS and JS post, or the HTML is the Web post, which HTML is the Web just came out like last week. It's a pretty good read. And that's it. Yeah, thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions?
Have you ever worked with like CSS only animations?
CSS only animations? I've done a little bit with them, but I haven't really done a lot yet.
Because when I had to do that, and what I noticed was they're really fast compared to JavaScript.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's why I think I
Can
forget.
you repeat the comment for the recording?
Oops. The question was, have I done much with CSS animations? And I haven't done a lot. I've done a tiny bit, but nothing really, really extensive. Okay.
If you try to apply this to Drupal, are there themes that help you with the following BEM conventions, or it has to be a custom theme where you do everything by scratch?
So the question was, does Drupal have any themes or anything like that out of the box that we can use to incorporate them without having to recreate your own theme? I'm trying to think if there is any. I don't know if anybody else knows. Benji, if you know any. Or
Maybe Zen?
Zen might. I haven't used Zen in a long time, so I'm not sure. I usually create all my own Drupal themes from scratch, so I don't really know what some of the other things offer. But yeah, it's a pretty big undertaking. I know Drupal core in general, I think, is maybe starting to do some BEM stuff. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, but it's kind of it's a massive undertaking because there's a lot of non-BEM. Not a lot of non-BEM in core, but I know there are some initiatives that are working on making things better, for making things more BEMified. So,
Thank you.
yeah. Good question.
So this is the devil's advocate, because I don't work on big sort of projects, and I found BEM really difficult to use, but there's other ways to target, like CSS is a huge resource, right? There's loads and loads of ways to target elements, and you can use child, sort of like rules, or like there's lots of different ways of doing it. I know, people who work in the way that I do, which is like a very small, like one person, kind of operation, you kind of get this, like it's not like I'm going to hand my code off to somebody else. You have your own kind of process, right? So,
Yeah.
I just thought I'd put that out because
Yeah.
I know I tried with them and then I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm writing and you can do, an element can have several different classes, which is to me easier than dash. I'm just going.
Yeah, if you have too many in a row,
Can you summarize the comment for that?
Yeah, sorry about that. So it's a comment on BEM, and it might be it's maybe hard if you're working by yourself and you're not ever going to be handing off your code to somebody else. I find it very difficult to kind of keep the underscores and the dashes and everything all together. And I've worked with a couple small agencies where there were maybe only 4 or 5 of us, and I know that's actually when I started doing some of the BEM stuff, and it was a pain in the ass when I first was doing it, because I'm just like, I actually really did not like BEM the first time I saw it. I thought it was super ugly. Like, all these underscores and dashes are bad. Like, this is terrible. And it's because I saw a lot of really bad examples. But once I kind of was forced to do it a little bit, I finally got more of my, I finally got it a little bit more, but it is a pain. It is a huge pain at first. So I definitely feel your pain. So. But it's also good if you want to keep it. And then if you come back to the code in like 6 months, it's good to actually be able to see what you did. So it kind of helps you out as well as, like, if you're not ever handing it out to other people, it helps you for down the road. Yeah. Yep.
Do people use Max anymore?
I think some people do, and I have used that before as well. I think that's more of a way to organize. I think that's more of a way to actually organize some of your partials and things like that.
Repeat the question.
Oh, man, I thought it was going to be so much better remembering to find the questions. The question was, do people still use things like smacks anymore? And I'm pretty sure they're still being used. I actually have seen a couple articles recently about people still using smacks. I will sometimes use it, but I don't really stick to that convention as much. But that is also a very useful convention if you want to keep everything kind of more componentized and put in partials. So yeah, it still has a use as well. Yep.
I might be in the wrong room for this. On the CSS and JS side, I wanted to say that CSS modules is worth looking at as an alternative to style components.
Yep.
Because it allows you to actually just write in a CSS file You can import things globally or scope it, so you can still like embrace the Cascade and stuff like that if you want to. So it's a little bit different, but it's still just CSS and JavaScript. So
Yeah.
find that useful.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, the comment was on looking into CSS modules and seeing how that might be a better option if I didn't want to use CSS and JS. And I've looked into it a little bit. I'm trying to remember what it was I didn't like. I can't remember if CSS modules is the one where it creates those classes that are like ZH259Z.
You can control it.
Oh, okay.
It does that by default, but you can tell it not to.
Oh, cool. That actually would be something more to look more into if I wanted to keep things componentized and scoped. So yeah, cool. Yep, Benji.
You said that these two parts of Sass are still useful, and I wonder, does that mean there are other parts of Sass that aren't useful anymore?
I think a lot of, like, I was kind of more emphasizing, and I maybe should have said this a little bit better, that these two things are, people complain a lot about partials and nesting, and I think I meant more to say that these actually are, like, they're useful and beneficial if you know what you're doing with them, because there is a lot, I've seen a lot of bad use, especially with nesting, I've seen a lot of really bad uses, so I think it was more about that. And again, the question was, the question was something about, like, why did I say that partials and nesting are still relevant? I meant to say that they are relevant, and I was trying to focus more on that people look at them negatively, and I wanted to show them in a more positive light. So, cool. Yeah?
So going back to the smacks thing, that's actually part of the Drupal 8 folder the theme structure.
Oh, you're right, yeah.
And for libraries. So those are like the different categories you can use, and then you have to install a module to do anything else, really.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the comment was that Drupal, the Drupal module, and Drupal core, I think, still does too, use smacks to organize the CSS files. And yeah, that's right. All right, are there any more questions?
Actually, I have one more
Yeah.
comment, why CSS is better than JS.
It's better, I didn't say that.
Media queries. I had this problem where I wanted the JavaScript not to occur on certain screen sizes, but when like iPads and iPhones came out, suddenly screen sizes became meaningless because they had more pixels than screens. So I had to use media queries to actually fire my JavaScript or to unfire my JavaScript.
Yep.
So I needed the CSS for the JavaScript to work correctly. So there.
CSS also has more letters, so when
Yeah, and that was a comment about one way CSS is better than JS, which I didn't say, but that media queries is a thing that makes CSS really, really still good as well. All right, is there any more questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.